Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. And my job today is really to set the scene for other speakers today, and also introduce actually some of the elements of the recent study that we did, which is a socio-economic study with a major thrust on agriculture to you. And I'll talk about that just a little bit later. But agriculture is no different actually on the North Coast to what it is actually in other parts of the state, other than the North Coast punches well above its weight in terms of its contribution to the gross value of agricultural activity across New South Wales. It produces nearly 12% of New South Wales' $6.6 billion worth of agricultural production. When we're talking here across the north is the Richmond Tweed, the centre is Grafton and Coffs, and the south is Bellingen south to Port Macquarie Hastings. Don't be surprised to only see 3.3% of gross regional product actually being associated with agriculture. That's atypical, and there are some very good reasons for that on the North Coast. Of course, 26% of North Coast regional product comes from, let me say, public services like education and training, health and social welfare, and a couple of other elements. Construction and manufacturing, for example, actually is about 12%, and retail is about 7%.
So Bruce, can I just ask a question? Have we factored in food manufacturing to that?
It's a good question. I was just about to come to it. That's farm gate. So it doesn't include any value added actually off the back end of it actually.
Norco, Nestle?
No. And we'll come talk about that actually in just a minute. But relevant to the number of total businesses actually on the North Coast, actually agriculture punches well above its weight. You can see there slight differences between the three regional subsets, if you like, for the North Coast, but it's about 18% of businesses on the North Coast actually have some agricultural flavour. Employment, and again I'm only talking farm gate, I'm not talking value added. It's about 4.6% of the working population, but again this excludes all of the owner-operator labour which goes into agriculture. This is a good example, I think, actually, of the top and bottom end of agriculture, if you like, and the increased dualism. So we're looking at the percentage of farms actually via their scale, if you like, their estimated value of their agricultural operations. And you can see there across the three areas again where we've got less than 50k, a lot of those farm units are supported by substantial off-farm income. We've got over 60% of those farm units actually have turnovers of less than 50k. Which contribute between 12 and 14% of the gross value of agricultural production on the North Coast. At the top end, which tends to get bigger, and this is atypical of agriculture across the world, not only just Australia, you can see you got 5% of your farm units with turnovers in excess of 350k, large-scale units contributing around 50% of the gross value of agricultural production. And in some industries the situation is more like 80-20. So again, we shouldn't be surprised by that. Beef is still the predominant activity right across the North Coast in terms of the number of farm units, and you can see there in the Richmond Tweed it's 44%, and on the mid-North Coast, which in this data series includes the Manning, it's over 60% of farm units actually are associated with beef. But you can start to see some of the movements now in some of the, if you like, I won't call the macadamia industry a new industry because it's been here for a while. Most of its growth is now occurring in Queensland. But you can start to see the influence of horticulture actually here, where 20% of the farm units are involved in fruit and nuts. And again, remembering the database here is the last census data, actually just 2010-11, you can start to see the movement actually in blueberries and the number of producers there. The dairy industry always has a very low percentage actually of primary producers in it, but punches well above its weight, and I'll show you why in just a minute. I think that's probably the major takeouts from that slide. You can still see that cattle across all of these actually is still the dominant industry, but its percentage to the gross value of production is probably not as high as the cattle industry itself wants to thinks it is. So you've got 25, 25 and 35. The dairy industry, again, if you look at the number of primary producers, which in those three categories ranges from 3% of primary producers through to 8%, punches well above its weight, and despite deregulation actually, as now its production levels actually in New South Wales, or milk production levels, are now growing, despite the fact that there's been an horrendous decline actually in the number of dairy farmers actually across the state since deregulation around 2000. And again, you're starting to see, fruit and nuts, you can see there that 20% of the farm units in the Richmond Tweed actually are associated with fruit and nuts, producing 18% of the gross value of agricultural production. And again, the blueberry industry is already in the central group, producing 43% of the gross value of agricultural production. And remember, these figures are 2010-11, and I'll touch on the growth in the blueberry industry in just a minute. So let's rank these industries again on the basis of that census data. The beef industry is still the major industry on the North Coast. If you look at the gross value of agricultural production on the North Coast, it's around $770 million, $750 million in round terms. The beef industry is still dominant. Dairy at that stage was sitting at number 2 at about 90 million. And blueberries at 70. Blueberries has already expanded through to about 120 million, and if prices hold, despite Melinda's comment about per punnet costs, it will be an industry of some $250 million in about 4 years. So to suggest that some of these industries can't rise rapidly through the ranks, actually, because of their lack of scale initially, I think you just need some enthusiasm and some organisation actually to drive these things. Sugar, again, a bit lower than only 60 million. Nurseries and cut flowers, an important growth industry at 61. Poultry, I found surprising at 54 million. And macadamias, despite the fact that the macadamia brand seems to be all over the North Coast, is not a major industry, and most of its growth is not going to be on the North Coast. And then we look at bananas and avocados, and then it tears down. And I'll come to how those industries are moving indirectly. And I guess you can see, I guess this is an estimate of their profitability. If you look at the gross value of agricultural production and divided by the number of hectares, you can, on that right-hand column there, you can see the value per hectare. And blueberries just is absolutely standout at $100,000 plus. So the next one, this comes from a recent study that we've done, and I recommend, this is on our website. It's a socio-ecological study of the North Coast, but with a particular emphasis on agriculture. And the back end of it has a lot of interesting data. So what we wanted to do was have a look at where these industries were moving from to their existing scale. So we had 5 indicators selected with 5 thresholds. So the 5 indicators just their turnover at that point across this. This is an 8-year period we did this study from 2005-6 through to 2012-13. So you've got their turnover, and then we've got actually the other indicators are turnover on a percentage basis, land use, area, production, and employment. And then on those last 4 indicators, what was the movement? Were they declining? Were they static? Or were they growing? So here's the end result of that. The key emerging industries, in every one of those categories, by the way, actually they were ranked from 1 to 5. So your maximum score could have been actually 25 in those 5 categories. So no surprises actually as to the key emerging industries: blueberries, poultry, eggs, and by beans they actually mean predominantly soybean. Vegetables, which somebody asked me about a minute ago, is clearly a growing industry, as is oilseeds. And then we start to have a look at the ones that are relatively stable. And there's some key traditional industries here, such as beef and dairy, I guess avocados and nurseries. And one of the surprises that comes out of it, I guess there's no surprise to know that the bananas is a declining industry, given the fact that it's giving up land to blueberries almost exponentially at present. Sugarcane's a declining industry. And macadamias actually, interestingly, came out as being a declining industry. Across those various key indicators, while macadamias are having a very good year this year in terms of production and in terms of prices, across those key indicators that I talked about, the only positive outcome for the macadamia industry was that its area under orchard was static. It was down on production, it was down on employment, etc., etc. I'm not decrying the fact that macadamias is not a growth industry in Australia, but it's currently not a growth industry on the North Coast. And as you all know, the worldwide demand for nuts keeps on increasing, and we've seen a massive expansion also down south in the almond industry. But the types of declines are quite are quite interesting when you actually look at the fact that the sugar area is down 23% across that 8-year period. The banana area is down 30%. The blueberry area across that 8 period was up 64%, with nearly a doubling of its area actually yet to occur, in line with some production levels that the blueberry industry's recently released. But there's one area where the databases are quite poor, and there are some people sitting here today who pointed this out to me at a recent workshop. The organics industry, which drives off fruit and vegetables in particular, but also beef, now in Australia has a turnover of $1.8 billion, and it's growing at about 15 to 20% per annum. So for those of you that are looking at organics, there's certainly some terrific opportunities actually for you, given the variation of climate and soils on the north coast of New South Wales. And when I come to it, I'll point out some international opportunities too.
Why is cut flowers down, given its return per hectare something like $78,000?
And this is just ranked across those 5 categories. If you add nurseries, cultivated turf and cut flowers together, actually it's an industry that I think has got a lot of potential. One of the problems I think for horticulture on the north coast, and Liz and I have been talking about it, is access to water. Horticultural industries, if they're going to have genuine scale, have got to have long-term permanent access to water, and that's where some of the things that Kempsey Council, and giving you a free plug, Liz, are looking at in terms of water recirculation, etc., etc. In Coffs, for example, they've already got a water recirc system of sorts, actually out of Woolgoolga back to the blueberry industry. So it can be done, and in the Shoalhaven, the dairy industry is the major benefit of their water recirc system there. But you won't find entrepreneurs wanting to put tens of millions of dollars into horticulture unless there is some permanent water there. So a quick summation. Beef, traditional industry, still the largest. Dairy industry, again, I think we are going to see some growth in the North Coast dairy industry. Now we've overcome, if you like, the tribulations of deregulation. Blueberries, I think blueberries really has the potential to be an industry that may actually come close to actually the scale of the beef industry on the North Coast, even though it's going to be heavily concentrated in certain areas. Macadamia industry is still and sugar industry, both traditional industries here, but sugar actually is a declining industry, and at best the macadamia is static, and most of the growth actually in the macadamia industry is occurring in the Bundaberg area of Queensland. And as I said, the Australian macadamia industry will continue to grow. Avocados, I made mention of there, growing competition from imports, not a major industry, but one which probably underpins some of the profitability in macadamias and some of the other industries. Poultry, it's an important domestic industry. Domestic consumption's expanding, and worldwide demand for poultry is expanding also. Plenty of opportunity, I think, on the North Coast to grow vegetable production, particularly given the diversity of landscapes and climates on the coast. Nurseries, again, I think actually, and I think we made mention of this a minute ago, actually, as you improve transport hubs and transport to major cities, you'll find that the vegetables and nurseries actually will, I think, grow substantially on the North Coast. And I put oysters down because I still think there's a chance for substantial growth there, but its growth really depends on the management, on the maintenance of catchment health, appropriate land use further up, such that water quality is not impacted. So I guess in essence, in summary, what are the key issues? Some of the key issues are really for local councils. Standing here, an intensification of land use, this peri-urban interface with blueberries is creating some concern, particularly in the Coffs area. So there really needs to be a fundamental need for some really good strategic land use planning. One of the things we talked about a while ago actually was possible constraints on the growth of emerging industries because of, in essence, a lack of a skilled labour force, and we've already got the blueberry industry importing labour using visas, and the blueberry industry itself is trying to spread itself into what I call sheltered horticulture to try and spread its labour force across the whole year rather than not have a peak labour use at picking time. An ageing farmer population, particularly in the traditional industries, need to encourage the entrance of young farmers, as I've said there. And this is really almost the Sydney first home buyer story. I mean, how do young farmers get entrance into agriculture given the types of fixed capital that are required? So you've got to be looking at other models. Dairy industry has always done it well because it's had share farming and leasing in place. And I might add the macadamia industry more recently has done some work actually about land leasing and profit sharing to encourage the entrance of young farmers. So it can be done, but it's not necessarily about training young farmers. It's about actually giving them the opportunities where they don't have this massive amount of fixed capital that they've got to find to actually start up and also get some size economies in their initial venture. Merging industries need to develop, as I've said there, best management practice. I think the blueberry industry is probably a case in point. It's really got to get an effective peak body established. It's got a voluntary R&D levy, and as you all know, with voluntary R&D levies, actually the tendency is that 50% of the population won't pay it. So there are some things, and it's now genuinely looking at some huge export market potential off the back of its growth, and also, I guess, off the back of the free trade agreement that's been signed with China. And I could make mention of what happened in New Zealand when it, about 5 or 6 years ago, signed a free trade agreement with China. Its dairy exports went up by 2 billion in the 4 years after it. So huge opportunities there. Productivity growth is also a problem in some elements of Australian agriculture, and I'll just swing to that. And you can see there in the 50 years to 2000, productivity growth in Australian broadacre agriculture. I'm not talking about the specialised industries now of horticulture, but it includes dairy, includes beef, broadacre cropping, mixed farming, as well as the sheep and wool industry. 2.5% a year. Across that period of time, the farm terms of trade was declining at about 1.7%. Most of the productivity growth in Australian agriculture is absorbed by the top quartile in the various industries. The bottom 50% actually really not absorbing most of the productivity options. But you can see there since 2000, actually, there's been quite a significant slowdown, down to about 0.8% per annum. A couple of reasons for that. One is the millennium drought that impacted on both sides of the continent on and off during that period. The other reason, which I won't go into now, is probably a slowdown in the level of public sector R&D, which is going into agriculture. And let me leave you with this thought. And I just had to be flicking through my computer the other day, and I occasionally go and look at the Washington Post, and they had some slides or some pictures of what was happening around the world in various ways, and I thought this was just a brilliant slide. So inside that circle, there are more people living inside it than there are outside it. And this sits on Australia's doorstep. And if you look at the size of the middle class in India and in China, enormous opportunities for us to market clean, green product into those parts of the world. And as an aside, in finishing, I was in Europe about 2 years ago, and as you do with when you're actually with your wife, you actually tend to go shopping. And I was fascinated actually by the number of Chinese trainees that were in really upmarket actually women's fashion, and also in say some of the upmarket men's stores such as Zegna. They all had a Chinese trainee who was going back actually obviously into China. And I remember talking to the manager of one of the Zegna stores, and Zegna sells more suits in China than it does in the rest of the world put together. So that shows you that 300 million and growing middle class. So I'll leave it there. I hope I've set the scene for you, and I hope it's a very productive day for everybody. Thank you.